Okay, well, I'm going to begin introducing, and people can sit down. I'll turn the lights off once we're about to start. So, welcome back. In this session, we are going to watch the film Baldwin's N-Word, made by the great Trinidadian director Horace Ové. And this is a film I'm sure many of you will have seen before. It's a recording of a speech that James Baldwin delivered at London's West Indian Students' Centre in Earl's Court on the 3rd of February 1968. And it's one of Horace Ové's earliest works. He'd just finished film school at the London School of Film Technique. He was already a Baldwin fan when he made this. Actually, his way into Baldwin was like Leela Hassan Howe, through Giovanni's Room first, and then through Another Country. And he'd heard that Baldwin was in London, he'd heard that Baldwin was in London, and a few days before the West Indian Students' Centre event, he met Baldwin at what Horace Ové describes as a gathering, and asked for permission to film the speech. He had no money, but Baldwin agreed to allow him to do so. And the result is this beautiful document that we have now. I wanted to say a few words about context for thinking about this film before we begin it. Not only to think about Baldwin, who we've already thought about in context quite a lot, but to think about the Britain that he's speaking in at that time. Horace Ové, when he's spoken about making this film many years later, remembered the West Indian Students' Centre at Earl's Court as what he described as one of the great meeting places of black political and cultural life. And it's something that Margaret Busby talked about earlier as well. You know, one-off event, these kinds of talks, bringing in the kind of luminaries of Black Atlantic politics and culture, were a relatively regular occurrence at the Students' Centre. It was, as Ové put it, quite a radical space. And you'll see how packed the meeting was as well. And it's an interesting audience, actually. When the camera pans back onto the audience at times, it includes, among others, Jessica Huntley, who'd go on to establish Bogle L'Ouverture, one of Britain's first black publishing houses and bookstores. Althea Jones-LeConte, who at that point wasn't, but soon would become the leader of the Black Panther movement in Britain. Next to Baldwin, Andrew Sulkey, the great Jamaican novelist. Young radicals from the West Indian Students' Centre. It is a vibrant room in which the politics of the moment are really alive. You know, 3rd of February 1968, the Tet Offensive was just beginning. The Newark had only recently gone up in flames. Britain's first Black Power organisation was founded not long before this. So there's a lot at stake in the room, and we really get a sense of that when we watch the film, which I think is one of the things that really brings it to life still. One of the joys of hearing the film, I think, is not only hearing Baldwin and Gregory speak, Dick Gregory, who speaks after Baldwin, but also hearing the room respond and hearing the conversation and feeling that sense of the kind of provisional and unfinished but urgent conversations that are happening, the questions that people are confronting that night, and what it says about what was going on in Britain as much as what it says about himself. So I'll begin the film in a moment, and then after the film we're going to have a panel conversation in which I'll be joined by Clive Nwonka and Campbell X. I will introduce them later so that we don't have to hold those in our minds, but we can look forward to that. It's 48 minutes long. Joining us now to respond to the film and to think more broadly about James Baldwin, Britain, James Baldwin and film, I'm delighted to be joined by Clive Nwonka, to the on my far left, and Campbell X. As ever, full biographies of the speakers are on this programme that we've handed round, so I'll keep my introductions brief. Clive is an Associate Professor of Film, Culture and Society at University College London. He's the author of Black Boys, The Social Aesthetics of British Urban Film, which came out in 2023. And he's a much in-demand film critic. And he also curated for us, for this project that we're doing on James Baldwin and Britain, a really wonderful programme of films at the Barbican last year that was shaped by his reading of James Baldwin's essay, The Devil Finds Work. So thank you for that as well. Campbell X is a film, television and theatre writer and director. He's the director of the award-winning queer romantic comedy Stud Life, which came out in 2012. and the soon-to-be released and probably soon-to-be award-winning Low Rider, a queer road trip film set in Western Cape, South Africa. Okay, I realised we didn't actually agree who'd speak first.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah.
For me?
You.
Oh man. What I wanted to talk about, really, let me sense, is first of all, you know, the film as a film is a wonderful document of people who were in Britain at a certain time. And it's really interesting with the cinematography concentrating on faces. Those faces are often missing, actually, in even dramatized ideas of the past in the UK. So it was good to see images of African descent men and women and Southeast Asian men as well. And the guy who was holding the Vietnam news, and Jimmy was referring to the conflict in Vietnam. Also, just to say, I've met Horace. Horace, interesting, I always used to see him at Pride. Because Horace, as you might know, is an artist, a filmmaker and a photographer. And he used to document Pride a lot. And he'd be like, he's a really cool guy. I've hung out with him in the past. He was accessible in the way which I noticed Jimmy and many of the forebearers were accessible, like Maya Angelou, Lila was speaking this morning. People just ring up. And James Campbell, I don't know if James is still here, randomly ringing up people and they're like, yeah, I'll come. Horace was a bit like that. And I think that we're losing that connectivity with people who we admire, people who we want to, get wisdom from. My interest in this film and Horace's film here is now we're faced with this kind of online, this diasporic wars. I don't know if people know about the diaspora wars. An African American will say something about Black British people, and then the Black British people will counter. And what I notice about somebody like Jimmy, Maya Angelou, Leila, Darcus Howe, Althea, is that, and thinking even of that, Miriam Makeba, they thought about the diaspora. So it wasn't just Jimmy Baldwin in the UK, but Jimmy Baldwin in conversation with African descent people in the diaspora. Because when he went to France, he hung out with the Algerians as well. So it wasn't just, France with white people, but also people who were formerly colonized. For me, questions have come up about James Baldwin, his identity as somebody who was not heterosexual. And I've been thinking about that a lot in relation to what he says about, I find what Baldwin says about race profound in that he acknowledges it's a construction. And he often spoke about white people as white people who think they're white. Very often he qualifies whiteness with think they're white, construction. And I myself, when I'm working or when I'm casting or when I'm thinking politically, often think, how can I take myself out of a construction of race? Because it is a construct, but we're still literally framed by that construction. And I personally find it frustrating. So when people were saying James Baldwin was hard to categorize, I think it was because he was also struggling with categories. And we have been categorized historically, scientifically, through a eugenicist way of seeing us as certain races, certain sexualities, which have a hierarchy. They're not coincidence. They're not coincidence that we were categorized as quote unquote Negro, quote unquote Asiatics, quote unquote Caucasians. These weren't just scientifically true constructs. They were explicitly done to create a hierarchy of the progression of humans. And it's the same, I think, personally, with sexual orientation and quote unquote desire. All of us sitting here, we have desires. Whether we use them to shape a public identity is up to us. Many people have secret desires. They never, quote unquote, come out. So again, when people question, well, why isn't Jimmy talking about, openly about who he was? I think he speaks about this. I think he coined the term burden of representation. He talks about it's almost like grappling with, it's not just the private and public, but I suspect the monolithic pressure of taking on a label, belonging to a group. So if you say, I am gay, and gay meant something very different in the 60s to what it means now. Now it means a cis gay man or a trans gay man. Then it meant everybody who wasn't straight. So, language has changed its meaning as well. When we use words, we have to realize the words that previously. But also, in this film, I was struck again by James Baldwin talking about origins and how you can't kill the African in us. And I've been thinking a lot, having just completed a film in South Africa in the Western Cape. And they have an idea of the Sangoma, a healer. And the Sangoma is often gender fluid, trans, queer, whatever. It's not a heteronormative term, and they're the healers. And I've been thinking quite deeply about the African within us, the West African. My ancestry is West African. And I think as a Caribbean descent person, I grapple with that complexity of a racial identity. Within me, there is the oppressor flowing in my veins. Within me, there's the Taino who were horribly treated when Christopher Columbus came to Jamaica. It comes from that. Within me are West African ancestry who were trafficked across the Middle Passage to the Caribbean. It is by accident James Baldwin's ancestors went to the Americas, mine went to the Caribbean. We're all connected. This diaspora thing means nothing to me. But what I want to say is, when I learn about West African identity in relation to gender and sexuality, there is no name, there is fluidity, there is the on-naming because it is natural. It's not considered an other thing, it's just considered part of life and also part of sacred spirituality. So back to the Sangoma, but also, and that's one example, but Mawulisa is considered the creator in certain spiritual beliefs in West Africa. So more and more, I am connecting with that and thinking about James Baldwin actually connecting with that in the on-naming, in the refusal to be categorized, because to be categorized is to fall within a white supremacist eugenicist framework of I am black, therefore I am this. I am gay, therefore I am this. He wants to insert himself as a spiritual person. He was a pastor, actually, and it's no coincidence he's a beautiful orator, because in the black church, Christian church in the United States and in the Caribbean, oratory is important. But it is important because of our West African ancestry, which is oral. It is not written. So we speak, we use music, we use dub. In churches, we use music, we catch a spirit. It's not written, about feeling. So I'll just end there, but it's just thinking, how do we unname ourselves because we have been named and framed by white supremacy. And how do we escape that naming and framing in order to free ourselves and in order to be completely authentic, to remove barriers as, you know, white, black, straight, gay, trans, cis, bi, pan, you know, all these categories. How do we just ask somebody, who are you? And there's a greeting in South Africa, in Xhosa, when they say hello, it's I see you. You know, Mwaleni, I see you. How do we really see each other rather than on see because of a filter of language that we have learned as categories? So that's, I won't ramble it. Thank you. Thanks, Clive. I think, you know, hearing your words was so important, especially about looking, how do we look at cinema and in what context do we see things? And there's an Odeon in Holloway Road, and it was majority people of African descent would watch films there. And how we watch films is not how majority white British audiences watch films. As you know, there's call and response. So, you know, like people often speak about, oh, I can't go to the cinema because people are just making noise. And I'm like, let the people make noise because it's an immersive experience. And how the Holloway Road film experience is something that I'm familiar with. And I saw in that talk with the call and response. People were responding to each other. The way Dick Gregory poured the glass of drink in response to the woman talking about drinking the same drink from him. It was just theatre, but I understood it as a particular kind of blackness from that side of the Atlantic. The other thing to me is the making of films. Baldwin tried to make films, and we spoke about Baldwin as an artist and being forced into kind of rhetoric and political articles. And I understood that struggle, actually. He wanted to do the autobiography of Malcolm X and got thwarted by Hollywood because they wanted to remove the significance of Malcolm X going to Mecca and becoming, you know, and doing Hajj. And the inherent Islamophobia of Hollywood, as then, still continues. But now they put Muslims in as terrorists. So, you know, it hasn't really changed. It's just morphed into something else. And you know, you think, what would it have been like if Baldwin had been a screenwriter, had been allowed to create work that was Baldwin-led rather than commodified in a capitalistic way by white financiers, and I use that word white as in mindset, who only see blackness in terms of struggle, not in terms of spirituality or healing or radicalism or rebellion. So, you know, what we see on TV or on cinema is what's been allowed to be financed. There are pitches for other things, they don't get the finance. And I say that as somebody who, my first feature film, Stud Life, was financed by the crowd, was financed by community. It was not financed by the financiers. It's a very different process. And obviously, Baldwin spoke about Hollywood and is American, and America is the Hollywood dream, is the fantasy that has been created of America. So I just wanted to talk about that. His relationship to Hollywood and cinema was always thwarted at some point as an artist. He was always curtailed into something. And vis-a-vis hunger, it's interesting. Steve McQueen's first feature film was Hunger, about Irish story about Irish rebellion, nothing to do with Caribbean. And James Baldwin's gay novel was about white gay men. The distancing is also, I think, a commercial decision too, because had he done about black gay men, that might not have got published. It was difficult enough to publish it. So we also have to think of capitalism and how it informs what we see and shapes identity as well. It's not just the real life in how people live. You know, we're being framed more and more. Actually, I just wanted to point that out as from a filmmaker's perspective.
I think there's a kind of danger of coming to Baldwin and expecting him to get it exactly right and be exactly speaking to us now. And even in that film, we see with that series of exchanges over what language we use to describe ourselves, that it's always on the move. It's always on the move. And this idea of taking an atemporal Baldwin, when we watched that film, it is impossible to escape from that historical moment. And yet at the same time, what I was thinking watching it just now is that one of the points that talks to me most directly now is when he says, I am at a point in my history where I have to question everything, right? And in a way that doesn't have to have and he says, and you're at a point at which you don't, and at which you can't, and he's responding to the white man in the audience. And I feel that is actually a dynamic that he is positioning, which isn't about getting everything right or having all the right answers, but about explaining how a historical moment shapes what's happening in his head and in that room. And in some ways, we've talked today about why is there a Baldwin revival right now, and I feel like that tells us something about what kind of returned to us at this point. And we can't hold him up and say, hang on, you didn't use the right vocabulary for that, or you didn't, that doesn't quite add up. But actually to see it instead, as you've both been saying this really, as an optic, as a way in, as a way of forcing us to challenge the categories and the assumptions behind the social world that we're, and the political world that we're inhabiting. So yeah.
Great, thank you. I want to come back to what you were saying, Campbell, about Baldwin and this idea of how do we unname ourselves and how we step outside of the confines that we're being put in, because it has been coming up a lot today how Baldwin was trying to resist categorization, and you bring up this idea of the Sangoma, of the healer, of their androgynousness and how they are resisting labels. And it's always struck me, I always think of Baldwin as it was mentioned before, he was before his time, he was of his time, but he was also something else. And he strikes me very much almost like a mystic, almost like a prophet figure, in that the way he is alienated from the time that he's in, like that being very much a quality of a mystic, but then also the way he talks about love and the fact that he might not have had the language to express this boxlessness, but when he talked about love, that seemed like that was how we could access it. And so all of these things that are buzzing in my mind as you're talking about how do we unname ourselves to be completely free, I just wonder if, now that I've presented all of these things, if you can respond.
Why you doing that? It's a process, really. It's something that I'm thinking through in my work, because there's a way in which what I'm seeing in the world right now is people are weaponizing those who have been othered. So how do we acknowledge James Baldwin as an actual human being who spoke wisdom and was a healer too, was a healer man in some kinds of ways, because he didn't just speak about the African American experience, he spoke globally. You know, he was speaking about colonialism. And I ask myself the question, why aren't we people doing this now in terms of artists or intellectuals? People stay within a lane of not my thing, I'm not talking about this. How do we bridge And that's what I'm talking about on naming, because the naming seems to be keeping us apart. That's my point. And cinema, I'm a filmmaker. Cinema is like the dream experience. When you're dreaming, you free yourself of your body. Cinema is dreams. So there's a darkened room, as in our heads, and then there's the screen. Yeah. How do we bring that experience of cinema into real life in terms of dreaming of something else that we're currently in? Very, how do we get out of how do we get out the framings? Even where it's like black and white, I feel uncomfortable because I know it is a construction. It was constructed to keep certain people subjugated and certain people wealthier, and it's being used more and more. How do we escape that? I don't have the answers. But I'm processing that because I'm seeing that we're being divided even more through fear and manipulation and these things.
Just had a really quick question. I'm curious about if watching this film and we're thinking about Baldwin's film theory, how do we account for the elements of his film theory that are about training the eye to see him on screen? I guess I'm thinking about this film and like how might we read this and read what happens in this film today as Baldwin anticipating people seeing him. I think about times watching clips on YouTube and going down a rabbit hole, and I'm fascinated not just by what he's saying, but literally there's something cinematic about watching Baldwin's interviews with a range of different people, and it's theater, and I guess I'm curious about whether or not how do we account for that within a notion of about Baldwin, and how he's training us to see.
Yeah, hi, Sophie. It's just a comment really around the framing of queer here, and this hierarchy kind of comment. Read your book, by the way.
Mine?
Yeah.
Thanks.
I love a book, man.
I want to just kind of reframe that. I don't know what I'm hearing is this notion of some kind of hierarchy around queerness referencing anything else. That's not actually historically true. Actually, there's been an erasure of queerness in relation to Baldwin up until pretty much the present day. When I was a teenager in the late 80s and beyond that, there was no kind of sense in which that queerness had any value in the cultural space that Baldwin had as a literary giant. And when as I was growing up in the 90s, there was no conversation around his queerness. I think when we look at what the definition of queerness is today, it's very many different things. One of those things is a space of possibility, a space of creativity, and it's not necessarily tied to gender or sexuality. It's tied to an idea of how things show up in the world. So I just wanted to point that out. So that can embrace, that's a width of embracing, not a narrowing of embracing. So it can involve film criticism, it can involve literature, it can involve oratory, it can involve blackness, it can involve trans rights, it can involve global liberation of the global majority, and that actually by kind of framing and understanding, we can't do this today, but where some of Baldwin's changing conversations around the inspiration of his sexualities is a kind of queerness, but that becomes something that is very generative, not something that's hierarchical. I think it's just something that's happening right now. For the first time I'm hearing it, even being invited here to talk about it. I mean, I've been invited to talk about Baldwin in the past, and it's never been about this. So I think it's quite a beautiful moment that this is also part of the conversation. Just a framing.
I add to what you just said. Thank you, Toka. I think and this might sound a little bit controversial, but blackness is queer. And so to try to separate it is ridiculous. That's what I was trying to say. Our West African ancestors did not make a distinction. The distinction was framed by white supremacy and possibly Christianity, which sees everything in binary, right? We're still framed by that binary. We're still having to wrest that binary away from discussions. Historically, when you think of Black queerness, even in America, it wasn't an issue when they were in their Black communities. It became an issue when they tried to break through to the mainstream. If you study Richard Pryor, study Ma Rainey, study Gladys Bentley, as soon as they, Little Richard, as soon as they tried to go into the mainstream, their queerness became verboten, became erased. So what I'm trying to say is, we've got to find another way of on-naming in order to include everything as interconnected, not Black or queer. Black queer, which is a phrase I think Marquise Bay uses as one word, and I find it quite useful because you cannot separate it and you cannot hierarchize it or whatever. I think a lot of the erasure has come from his estate as well, which happened as well with Langston Hughes. You know, again, a kind of Christianized way of looking at identity and sexuality, which we have incorporated as if Black. It's not. It is actually white supremacist. And it's how we unlearn. I'm unlearning. I'm trying to unlearn that way of seeing myself and other people, but it keeps getting washed over by whiteness, white noise. Oh my God. There is a song.